Okay. Thank you for folks who are able to share. And I did put on closed caption. I apologize if it's a little difficult to hear or understand. I will try to talk slow, which is difficult for me, but I'm going to try. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with an amazing artist and also a friend of mine, Grace Athena Flott. Grace is a 2022 or 2022 Hope Corps grant recipient with the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture for a collaborative portrait project of burn survivors. Grace's work has been featured in publications such as Fine Art Connoisseur, Seattle Refined, Realism Today, and Real Change. And her work has also been at major exhibitions at the Museum of Modern European Art in Barcelona, Spain, Shades of Blue at Equity Gallery in New York City, and Grace had her first solo show here in Seattle at Figurehead Gallery in May of 2022. Grace is also a graduate of the University of Washington and the Juliet Artiste's Atelier, and Grace received the Bridges Center's Gunlock Scholarship in Labor Studies in 2012 and is a former union organizer. You can check out more about Grace, her work, and contact her through our website, which is going to be linked in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us today, Grace, and I'm excited for a chance to talk with you about your work and the labor issues you've experienced here as an artist in the Seattle metro area.
Thanks, Rachel, for that introduction. It's really nice to be here with the Bridges Center at the University of Washington and a couple of other artists on the call and folks from Seattle and the Northwest. So yeah, I'm excited to get started, and feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go along here. And it's going to be recorded, so I'm excited to share this with more folks.
Thanks, Grace. So I'm wondering, to start us off, if you can tell us a bit about your work as an artist and how you got here.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just share a couple slides for people who are not familiar with my work, and just talk through the path to becoming a professional fine artist, which can be very opaque. And I hope, to illuminate just how similar what I do is to a lot of other jobs, and share a little bit about what it means to be a working artist. So can everyone see the PowerPoint? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so for folks who don't know, this is essentially a summary of what Rachel just shared, but I grew up in Spokane in Eastern Washington, and my path to becoming a working artist certainly was not inevitable, as anyone from Eastern Washington knows. Shout out to Drew. So I came over to Seattle and was generally interested in just social justice, and found myself taking the broad humanities courses in international studies and French, and ended up organizing with the United Students Against Sweatshops, a student labor organization or student solidarity organization on campus, and was sort of on a path to go into labor and economic justice. And then I went on a study abroad program and was injured in an apartment fire. So that event sort of altered the course of my life and came back around into my work as an artist, painter, educator, and advocate. So I went through the rest of school with the Bridges Center and the Jackson School for International Studies, and then decided I wanted to continue in organizing for a while. So like Rachel mentioned, I worked with SEIU 1199 Northwest for just about a year, not too long. And continuing to pursue generally social justice, and also worked with another foundation, the Justice Fire Safety Foundation. So I had sort of workers' rights, fire safety, and was always really interested in working in community. But after a while, because I had gone through this radical injury, um, I said I need to find something more meaningful for myself. Not that labor isn't meaningful, but I think I was sort of searching for a way to express what I had been through. And I found this school here in Seattle. Had always been artsy as a kid, but again, just didn't really think that it was like a real job, so to speak. And I walked into the school, the Gage Academy of Art, and I saw on the wall all of these paintings and drawings that were looked like they had just been lifted out of a museum. So I thought, this is something that really resonates with me. I can understand these images. I had never been someone who was really into abstract or conceptual art. Again, was raised in a part of the country where I didn't have a lot of exposure to museums really at all. Most of the art I had seen was in books. So I found this place where I saw that I could make images of myself and people who looked like me. And at this time, again, I was going through a recovery from a pretty serious injury. I had burn scars and had gone through, a lot of like big changes. So the education for me was like a new tool of communication to kind of express a lot of these ideas that have been simmering for a while from a background in humanities, social justice work. And this is a little bit about the school that I went to for folks who are unfamiliar. So it's an atelier, and it's designed after schools from the 19th century where a small group of students will study under a professional artist. So we did Monday to Friday, 8 to 5, 8 hours a day, or 9 to 5, 8 hours a day, drawing and painting from life. So you learn to recreate what you see in 3D, and you recreate it in 2 dimensions on paper or canvas. So realism. And the whole idea is that you're imitating nature, right? So you gain this skill set, and then you have a language that you can go and use to say whatever it is that you want to say. So that was a 4-year program. Again, 9 to 5, 9 months of the year, basically like a full-time job. And these are some of the more academic works that I was making earlier on. So a lot of portraiture. Again, it's painting stuff to look like stuff. So figure, portrait, still life. And you can see here, this is a self-portrait back when my hair was much shorter. But there's a bit of my interests coming back in. So interests in self-portraiture, expressing my experience as someone who has disfigurement, speaking about mental health. A lot of my work started to become more about femininity and stories around gender. So this is a 3-piece still life painting. These are all oil paintings. And the work takes a long time. So this style of painting is quite labor intensive. And skipping a few years here, what I'm doing currently that I wanted to highlight is a very community-based project. So Rachel mentioned I received a Hope Corps grant from the city of Seattle recently, and I'm using it to pursue a project that feels like it's been in the making for a very long time. And it's very near and dear to my heart, but it's combining portrait paintings with interviews with burn survivors. So folks from my community to explore and create a history of a lived experience of disfigurement and disability. And I'm starting to experiment more, working with other people doing other types of work besides painting. So the scar print on the lower left is essentially created by rolling ink directly onto one's skin and then pressing paper and lifting that paper off of the body. So a real collaborative project that I'm hoping to build out over the next, well, over like a lifetime, I think. So things are coming back around together from, everything that I was sort of thinking about with power and the body, things that I was reading about race, class, gender, critical studies back in school at UW, and now combining that with painting. And we will get into this, but I love, this is an illustrator that creates for a lot of different magazines, but for the New Yorker. And I love this. I saw it this morning. And this is sort of a summary of what I do on a day-to-day for folks who are like, well, that's beautiful art, but like, what is your job, right? So lots of different things. There's a commission. This is a commission here on the lower left. I do a lot of teaching online, mostly now, applying for grants, selling my own work, and what don't I do, really? So that's what we'll get into. Okay.
Thanks, Grace.
Awesome.
You really did hit a lot of what our questions will further examine. So I'm going to jump right into something I've thought a lot about and we've talked about over the years is kind of what does it look like? And you mentioned this, like you do all these different things, but they may not be as visible to people who are just seeing your artwork at a museum or what have you. Can you talk about the balance of kind of the things that you do besides the selling the art? You paint, you have commissions, you teach. Can you talk a little bit about like what an average month looks like in terms of that breakdown?
Yeah, so I teach 2 days a week. Typically, I will do a group class, and then I have a small group of private students that take up about 2 days of my week teaching. And that is the most consistent and long-term every month. That's very regular. Those classes I am signing up to teach through other institutions, like on a quarterly basis. So those are contracts. My students work directly with me, so they pay me directly. So I'd say that's about 20 to 30% of my time. And it just depends. Everything else is very in flux. This time of year is often when I'm getting more commissions for the holidays. People will do a lot of commissions like for Mother's Day, anything that's like gift related. So that can be busy. The grant is new. So this grant is the first one that I've ever gotten. And that has really now prioritized the Burn Survivor Project. Last year, it was focusing on producing the solo show. So it's very up and down. Teaching is the most stable. So there could be really great months. If there's a big family portrait that comes in, that can make things last for a few months, and then there might be nothing. So yeah, it's a lot of like trying to weather like those storms.
Thank you. Can you speak a little bit about, you're an independent contractor, and I don't know if that's typically how folks think about somebody who's a fine artist is as an independent contractor. Can you talk about how you prepared for being one and what that looks like for you and any advice you'd give to others?
Yeah, I did not prepare at all. So No, art school teaches you how to be an independent contractor or freelance person. I don't know any school that does that actually for any field. So um, yeah, being an independent contractor just in general means, I get a 1099 and it means that I report all of my income as a self-employed person to the IRS. So every time I get paid, 30% comes out. So it's a big chunk, right? So I pay all the taxes that an employer would otherwise be putting up, or like the self-employment tax. So instead of 15%, it's 30. Um, that was something I had to learn, right? I took a lot of like seminars through, there's Artist Trust is an organization here that does education and like funding for artists. I basically had to cobble together sort of my own business degree in a way. I had to figure out, how to create an LLC, do the taxes, do bookkeeping, do point of sale. Um, I don't know, there's just a million things. So contracts as well. It's a really big thing for being an independent contractor. Just negotiating is a huge skill. Again, not painting. It's a totally different skill set. Yeah. So it's been a lot of learning.
That makes sense. It's a lot of things to keep track of.
Hmm.
Something we've talked quite a bit about is the inherent worth of art and what art really does mean to individuals as well as communities, and our need for it, and how it's not just a frivolous thing. Can you talk a little bit about the service that you and other artists really provide for communities?
Yeah, I guess I would just say, like, imagine if the world had no color. Imagine that you couldn't go see your favorite band. Imagine that it's just the pandemic all the time and there is no virtual art, there's no virtual performances. There's no movies, right? This is like the value that we add. Um, I think it's pretty simple. Nobody moves to a neighborhood because it's full of tech workers, right? I live in Capitol Hill in Seattle, and people don't move there because investment bankers live there. They move here because it's quirky, right? There was a literal Amazon PR recruiting campaign that talked about, I think they mentioned the circus, or like, the circus, I'm gonna mess up the name. It's where you can go and like be an acrobat, right? There's a business in South Seattle where you can learn to do that. And all of those people are, work there, and then they also perform, right, in gigs all over the city. Anytime you want to take your boo out on a fun date, right, you go see a comedy show. Um, you want to be fancy and cultured, you take them to the museum. Or you want to find a, enrichment program for your kids, you take them to a museum for a day of free art. Or maybe you have someone who's really interested in learning art. I mean, learning guitar, piano, it's all the same, right? So I think, yeah, there's so much to say for the value of art. Yeah, I could go on and on.
I wonder, something we talked about yesterday when we connected before this was kind of the exposure that artists are expected to go after, right? And how that should be almost payment enough sometimes. Where do you think that misconception came from, and how does that show up for you and other artists?
The exposure, what did you say about like being expected to work for free kind of thing?
Yeah, or free, or just maybe not what your art is necessarily worth, because a lot of people might be seeing it at a big public event or.
Yeah, so people basically have a concept, and I think this is more of like a stereotype than what people are consciously thinking, of course, but there's the idea that we all love what we do, and so you'll never work a day in your life. And I think that it's interesting because a lot of people actually do like their jobs. Maybe if you're an organizer, you like your job. It doesn't mean that you like everything that you have to do, but the core of it is that you think your work is meaningful. And we also think our work is meaningful. It doesn't mean that we should be expected to work for free, right? I see a lot of, especially younger folks, get into this field. And also, when I was in school, there would be like postings for a gig, and it might say, I remember this one in particular. This is a true story. The the Ferrari dealership that's in central Seattle and Capitol Hill needed to activate one of their sales events. And they contacted our school and said, do you have any artists that can come do live painting at this event? And they were going to offer hors d'oeuvres. So for payment, it was hors d'oeuvres, and it was $25. So at the Ferrari dealership. So that's a pretty extreme one, but that kind of thing happens a lot. And, there's a lot of different ways that people choose to value their work. Like, we could talk about pricing, we could talk about how much people charge just to be like a consultant on an hourly basis. But I think for cultural workers and artists in general, it's so interesting to me that it's one of these fields where it's almost like we're starting from zero. Like, people just, instead of saying, yeah, we know you're worth it, but like not that much, right? It's sort of like there's just this like idea that you're so desperate that you'll do anything, right, to get your name out there. And that's not sustainable. And that also means that the folks who can afford to go into this field are honestly people like me. They're white, they're economically privileged and able-bodied, right? They have a financial cushion that is able to get them through some of these really degrading experiences, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that point. We talked about that a bit yesterday of when people have the same identities and they're the ones that are able to stay in this world and able to make the art and maybe be able to have that be their full-time job, opposed to something that they're doing when they have time. That impacts all of us. Thanks for bringing that up.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Ferrari dealerships, besides them, what's your advice for kind of the typical person who wants to support artists and maybe is looking into getting a commission, but maybe just doesn't know much about how to do this, like how to be both respectful of folks' work, but also maybe they have their own financial stuff going on as well. Like how would you advise somebody to approach an artist about commissions, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that like there's a lot of ways to support artists. Not everyone is, well, I would say that the idea of an artist is that they're only making fine art luxury goods. And actually, most of us are doing a lot of different things. So I think, I could just say almost everyone I know who is in fine art is also making prints of their work. They are teaching, they are showing at a gallery, they are working on a public art project, a mural, like tons of different stuff. So I think expanding out from just the only way that I can support an artist is by dropping 5 to 10 grand on an original painting. Not everyone can do that. So there's lots of ways to support. And, if you do want to commission something, I think most people are pretty open to like working something out, right? With like a budget that you have. Like it's very rare. People are super respectful, actually, when it gets down to it. So yeah, supporting an artist, I think that's like, just do it to begin with, right? Most people actually don't support artists at all. Like the people on this call, like some of folks I know have, but like think to yourself, when was the last time I bought art from an individual? When was the last time I bought something to put on my wall that wasn't from IKEA? So I think it's just starting with, who do I know? How do I support them? What are they already doing? Right? And they'll be super open to working with you.
Makes sense. So when we first connected on this conversation last, I believe August, it was right after the Puget Sound Regional Council dropped this arts and culture economic recovery strategy report that had a lot of information, including survey results from local artists in the Seattle metro area. And it discussed pandemic impacts, which we know were extreme to the region's art scene. It also talked about some of the big things that artists are citing as reasons to either not be able to do this anymore, or maybe to be able to do this in a much more limited way. And the cost of living came up repetitively, as well as just the expectation for people to, as you've mentioned, maybe do something for much less, the Ferrari effect, shall we name it. So I'm wondering, Grace, can you talk a little bit about how these findings, do they reflect your experience? Do they reflect the experiences of artists you know? And is this something that you've spoken about with other artists?
Yeah, I skimmed through the report ahead of this talk, and just the issues around, basically the number one issue being the low wages in the region, the lack of benefits, access to benefits, lack of predictability and job security, lack of access to affordable housing and healthcare and childcare. So 100%. Yeah, like everyone I know is going through these things. I've known a lot of people who have had to leave the city because it's just not affordable anymore. Um, yeah, I'm here in my studio at the Inscape Arts Building, which is the former INS, Immigration and Detention Center, and has been renovated for artists and artist nonprofits. And we are, I believe, the largest studio building left in city limits, or one of the largest, and the property is not owned by us. So we are, the property's for sale. So we're facing like the potential gentrification of, one of the more affordable and largest artist workspaces in our city. So yeah, the findings absolutely reflect a lot of the issues that are happening. I think there's a lot of structural problems, of course, with housing and affordability in Seattle. But yeah, on an individual level, I think it's having the effect of people either having to move really far out of the city, leave completely, or I've had friends who have left to go into other fields, go into tech, go into art, like adjacent fields like graphic design and video game design. Yeah, so there's been a big incentive to basically leave. Yeah. And I think in that report, one thing that really struck me was that Washington as a state is 46th in the nation for public funding of the arts. So we're in the bottom 5 for funding of the arts, which is wild, because we think that we are on like the left coast, and right, it sort of is interesting. Yeah, when you think about, we're also like, we have a very regressive tax system, and like, where do public funds come from? So
Yep.
we're really underfunding the arts as a whole, and that has an effect not just on public funds, but on nonprofits, because nonprofits also get state funding with private donations and corporate donations. It has an effect on like I said, where people choose to move. So the picture is a little bleak.
Yep. I don't know why I laughed at that, but it is bleak.
Oh, we go.
Yeah, it's, I guess, laugh or cry. Uh, I too am not from the Seattle area. I'm from an area that I'm from Montana. And I think when I was growing up, I would look at a place like Seattle and think they must really care about art. You think about the grunge scene, you think about just even the size of the area comparatively to a lot of us who came from smaller areas. And do you think, have you met artists who've come to this area and have been a little shocked at maybe not just the cost of living and things that you could easily see ahead of time potentially, but just the lack of infrastructure to support people in the arts and people generally, I would argue.
That's a good question. Yeah, interestingly, I think that I've met more folks, at least in the last 5 years, who have moved here from other major cities. So from LA and New York, or New Orleans and Chicago. So places that might already be very expensive, like from the Bay Area. And
Yeah.
so it seems like, just anecdotally, it feels like people are moving here because it might be still one of the cheaper metropolitan areas, which is very scary to me. Not that they're coming, but just that it's somehow cheaper than other cities, right? Uh, and that's like, where do then folks go who are going to be displaced, right? And like you see, where I'm from on the east side of Washington State in Spokane, you see that there's now a housing crisis over there.
Yeah,
There's obviously, yeah, spillover.
totally. So we talked a little bit about policy solutions, but I want to, before we get into policy solutions, thinking about just general stuff that would support artists and others, also want to think about organizing, right? You came from a labor and organizing background, and what do you think collective action would mean for independent artists like yourself?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I think it's important to, I think, put it in the context of like other art fields, like Seattle musicians are organized.
Yep.
They are also independent contractors. I think it's the American Federation of Musicians, and they have a local here. They have collectively bargained for healthcare. There's the stagehand union, stagehand and like theater support folks who do all the setup for all kinds of events. That's IATSE, I think local 15 or something. And of course, they are a full-fledged union with all the ability to negotiate for wages and such. I think in visual art, it's really tricky because we are incentivized to be successful as individuals and to compete against each other. So I think it's sort of like massage therapists or perhaps therapists, psychotherapists, other folks who like work in isolation, right? We largely work in isolation, even though we collaborate with a lot of different people and with each other. And we set our own prices. So it's tricky, but I think there's a lot that could be gained from actually a couple of things. I would say there's not a lot of transparency between fellow artists about how we price our work. It's still a huge taboo, at least in my experience, for folks to share how much they charged for a commission. It's a taboo in general to talk about your pricing. Also, I know that a lot of galleries will still operate on a handshake agreement. So you have folks entering into like business partnerships where you're saying, here's all my work. go and sell it for me, take a cut, um, without anything in writing. And this is like super common. Okay. So it's like shocking, I think, if you're not in the art world, but it's really unregulated. And a lot of these relationships are built on trust and on like your reputation and things that are like essentially unquantifiable. So there's a degree of opacity and also of gatekeeping that happens. And I think we could do well as artists to just be more open with each other. I think if folks were able to come together for collective action, it could be for sure around negotiating or purchasing healthcare together. That would be huge. I think that there could be greater demands for just more standard artist gallery contract language,
Mhm.
or perhaps even just a resource bank with a kind of standard template.
Oh.
I think that what I've seen, for example, this is like an organization in New York that's called WAGE, Working Artists in the Greater Economy.
Mm.
And I don't know if they're active anymore, but what they did is they would, what's the word? They would give a certification to nonprofits and grant administering organizations. They would be certified with a stamp that said, this organization has agreed to pay all of the artist contractors X amount, right? Basically create the floor for wages. So I think there's a lot that could be done. I don't think it would look like a traditional union structure because, of course, we don't have a single employer. But there's a lot of benefits that we could gain from, yeah, from coming together. And then like on a more systemic level, I mean, I think it would be really wonderful to see Seattle implement a program like we have in San Francisco, which is the Artist Basic Income Program, right? Like we just need more public funding for the arts. So we like spend a lot of time marketing. We have to spend a lot of time hustling for our next gig and hustling for fundraising. And a lot of that pressure could be taken away if we just lifted the floor a little bit and said that actually we need art and culture workers to stay in the city because they add value to the city.
Yeah. I'd like to circle back to some of the work that you're doing, which does add just an incessant amount of value to how we perceive beauty, how we perceive what is the gaze. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the work that you're doing with other burn survivors and what that means to you and the burn survivor community.
Yeah, sure. Like I said, was injured in 2011 and have spent like the last decade basically unpacking this experience. And I have done a lot of self-portraiture because I think it's important. I think representation is important. And I did not see anyone in the media that looked like me. So of course, as a white woman, I have, but not right in the sense of like we have one kind of beauty, right? And a lot of visual art is about creating things that are beautiful. So I feel like I have the skill to take things that might be ordinary or even seen as monstrous and grotesque and make them beautiful. So I started doing portraits of friends who are also burn survivors. And I, yeah, it's been amazing. I mean, I have a couple, 3 or 4 portraits done and one going right now. And I'm combining it with interviews. So we I already know everyone, so we do a lot of conversations, but we record one of them that's really about the lived experience of disfiguration or disfigurement and disability. A lot of the narratives, like to me, the power of this project is that there's a overarching or mainstream narrative around these issues. And that narrative is that people who have physical differences are villains and monsters, right? They are the Freddy Krueger, they are Darth Vader, they are Deadpool, right? There's just so much representation of people, negative representation of people with scarring or disfigurement, just represented as like morally harmed, morally less. So we do interviews around like, what is your actual experience living in this body, in this world? What kinds of stories would you like to see? What has it been like for you navigating with your scars, and what do your scars mean to you? What does it mean to be a burn survivor? Just unpacking a lot of that stuff in a more holistic way. And then the scar prints, I'm interested in doing, actually as part of the grant that I just got, I'm doing a workshop with other burn survivors to make the scar prints together. So that's been kind of like a little experiment so far. And I'm going to expand that and start working with groups to do those prints. So I hope to basically create a kind of, it's like a oral history and a new kind of visual record. And I would love to put it out there. It's not commercial. It's hope that the grant funding or other fundraising can continue. And eventually it'll become part of a public collection or can tour in an exhibition.
Thanks, Grace, for talking a little bit more about that. And right before we go and give folks some opportunity to ask questions of Grace, I wanted to ask, thinking again about organizing and thinking about imagining maybe a more equitable and sustainable future for Seattle and Washington area artists. What do you imagine the future of the art scene in Seattle to be? And maybe in an idealized future, or maybe just a future you're hoping for yourself and others?
Yeah. Wow, love this. If I was really, really, really hopeful, I would say that we would increase the head tax on Amazon, and we would publicly invest in all forms of art. And that would just look like having a bigger piece of the pie, and folks like me not having to compete so much against each other for this tiny, tiny slice of the big pie. So, for individual artists and culture workers, that'd be amazing. It would also be amazing for all of the venues, right? So nonprofits and for-profit venues wouldn't be closing, right? We would be expanding them. We could have more public art just out in the community. There's a lot of organizations right now who just have not even recovered from the pandemic in a real way. Like a lot of museum visitorship is down by 50% still. So it'd be amazing. I think public funding in the arts, that's sort of general, but I'd also love to see like a prioritization of BIPOC and disabled artists in that investment. I think the Hope Corps grant program is a great example of that. There's a lot of good work happening. I think more transparency for in grant administering organizations, just around like demographically who is receiving funding, I think could be a lot more equitable. And of course, more equitable hiring in all the venues. Because predominantly the art scene in Seattle, I think it's predominantly controlled by white able-bodied folks. Yeah.
Thanks, Grace. That's a good future for us all to try to ascribe to in supporting the arts and in our work. So I want to give us some time here. We have about 10 minutes for folks to ask Grace some questions, any questions you have, and you can put them in the chat if you'd like, or please just come off mute if you're on mute and ask your questions.
I'll start. Hi, Grace. First of all, you speak so beautifully. It's so awesome to hear you share about this. I guess the first, I have a million questions. I wrote them down on a Post-it, but my really biggest question is, when you started sharing about what drew you to Juliet's atelier in the first instance, I guess my question is, why realism? It's not something I've ever asked you. And I guess I see a thread in the things you've shared today about why that might be a format that you're drawn, or a style you're drawn to, but I'd love to know, like, why realism?
Yeah, thank you, Annalise. I think there is a thread. Like I mentioned, I think I said this, that it's a communication form. And I think that we all choose mediums or styles that feel like we can clearly communicate through them. And I think as somebody who wasn't really around the arts very much growing up, realism, right? It's just illustration. Like, I understand what this is. And it's also, so it's a powerful storytelling tool. Yeah. And I think I wanted to be able to tell stories, right? And be able to reach folks like the people that I grew up with, or my family, you know, that's like more rural and more working class. I certainly love almost every form of painting. And now I'm really interested in a lot of different things, but initially that's what drew me to it. So yeah, I'd be curious about what you think the through line is. But yeah, I think there certainly is one. Nice.
Okay, well, I'll ask my other question.
Go for it.
For a painting like the one of Alizé, do you work from I assume you work from a photograph? And can you maybe share a little bit of, or maybe you don't, could you share a little bit about, with portraiture of that type, what is the process? And do you work from a photo, or what's the live interaction versus, because given what you've shared about the process and the time, I would be, from my perspective, I'm imagining there's no way you could have the subject sitting for that many hours. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what that looks like.
If I could afford to pay someone to sit there for that long, I probably would. But because it's about an experience, like sharing an experience with somebody. Like, a lot of people will look at my work and be like, that looks like a photograph. But there's a lot more that goes into it than that. There's a lot of texture. And when you work from life, it can be basically creating a record of a collection of moments, right? Watching the person's mood change over time, and just like sharing that experience with them. But no one has that time. So in those portraits that I've started with the Burn Survivor Project, I'm doing what I can from life. So mostly doing like a small study where I'm capturing the color information, which changes with a camera. So cameras will really change color, they'll change the light and dark and all that stuff. And then we do a photo shoot. So I'm usually working from a main like reference image, and then there's like 300 other pictures that I can look at and my color study. And then if I need to, and the person is local, I'll have them come back and not even have them like pose for the painting, but just basically, you know, make sure that I didn't miss something. So yeah, it's a long process. Those paintings take about 100 hours each. Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah.
Grace, thank you for sharing your story and about the art community and organizing. I had a question about when art workers do organize, like they have in Seattle at the Fry Art Museum, or the security guards at Seattle Art Museum organized recently. How are they received in the art community generally? Is there a lot of support, or is it seem like an outlier? I guess, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, obviously, I think it's great. I think people are generally supportive. I haven't met anyone that isn't supportive. I also think that not too many people even know about it, to be honest. I think, you know, a lot of art workers are basically just trying to constantly hustle and work all the time, right? So I don't know if there's a lot of bandwidth for keeping tabs on art organizing movements. But I think there's a lot of support. And I think there's a broad understanding that we, in general, are underpaid. So yeah, I think there's a lot of understanding. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question. Hi, Grace. Big
Hi.
fan. Have one of your studies on my desk right here. So
Oh,
big
God.
fan over here. I'm curious, like you've been on this journey for a while and wondering if there's something that you would tell yourself, like if you could tell yourself coming into this work as a worker, like advice you'd give yourself with the knowledge that you have now of how challenging it is to be an artist as a worker.
It's a good question. I think I would just tell myself that it takes time and to really focus on building community with other people right from the start. Because I think the natural path is this stereotype that you're like a solo genius artist working alone in your studio, and like that whole traditional idea about I'm just going to make a bunch of work and then go out and get a gallery and then I'll be good. And from what we've talked about, like I do so many different things. And it took me a long time to sort of accept that that was going to be the case, that I wasn't just going to be making paintings. I was going to be making classes and teaching them and working with other people for private commissions. So I think, you know, I would just tell myself that I think I would just give myself some business advice and tell myself to go meet as many other types of art workers as possible, because that is really where I've learned a lot of this, is just from peers and from folks who are maybe 5 or 10 years ahead of me. So like through mentorship and basically just creating a stronger network. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
So we have a few more minutes. Is there anybody else who'd like to jump in with a question for Grace?
Well,
Okay,
nice.
well,
Everything.
I guess you did such a great job in the conversation. So many questions were answered. So I want to thank Grace for taking the time today and joining us, and just also just providing a lot of perspective in a lot of different spaces and thinking about organizing, as well as in just increasing what we see in art and what that does for community. So thank you for coming and having this conversation with us today, Grace. And thank you to my coworker Andrew for helping, as always, with getting this running smoothly. And thank you for all of you who joined today in the afternoon. And this will be posted online as well. So hopefully folks will also be able to see Grace's amazing conversation there too. So thank you, everybody. And I look forward to seeing folks soon.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really nice to connect back with the Bridges Center. And I think it's just a really important conversation. And I hope for all the artists that see this, that we can start to have these conversations. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.